Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into a topic that ancient Egyptians didn't just take seriously, they took it to a whole new level. We're talking about sex. Yep, sacred rituals, wild mythology, surprisingly honest love poems, and even some eyebrow raising art. The Egyptians were more open, creative, and experimental than most folks today. And that's saying something. But before we get too comfortable, do me a quick favor, like this video. If you enjoy what I do here, and subscribe if you haven't already. Also drop a comment, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing viewers from all over the world tuning in to learn and chill together. All right, dim the lights, maybe grab a drink, or turn on that soft fan hum in the background, and let's take a slow, thoughtful stroll through a civilization that blended the sensual with the sacred in ways that might just surprise you. See, ancient Egyptians didn't treat sex like a scandal. They treated it like plumbing, necessary, functional, and ideally with no blockages. It wasn't something hidden away behind closed doors or dressed up in awkward metaphors. Sex was just part of life, as normal as the sun rising, as natural as the Nile flooding, and as casual as cats being, well, cats. And that attitude, it didn't mean they were reckless or overly indulgent. Far from it. Egyptian society was built on the principle of Ma'at, that's cosmic balance, harmony. Everything had its place, and that included sexuality. It wasn't taboo, it wasn't dirty, and it definitely wasn't something to be ashamed of. Instead, it was sacred. It was tied to fertility, to health, to the gods, and to the very fabric of survival. This wasn't about hedonism, it was about balance. If your love life was healthy, chances are the gods were smiling down on you. If it wasn't, well, maybe you needed to offer something to Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, and reevaluate your use of honey. Seriously, this open-grounded attitude about sex showed up in nearly everything. In art, in literature, in medicine, and even in architecture. Temples included carvings of fertility deities. Homes often had designated private spaces for intimacy. And believe it or not, ancient architects had the good sense not to build bedrooms right next to granaries. Love doesn't bloom next to grain sacks and rats, apparently. And unlike many cultures that came after them, ancient Egypt didn't have a complex about celibacy. They didn't punish people just for having sex. There were no big purity movements, no scarlet letters, no society-wide shame cycles about who did what with whom. Instead, your social value was more likely to be tied to how much land you owned, how white your linen was after hanging it in the sun, or how bountiful your barley harvest was. And if you're wondering why sex was seen as sacred, why it wasn't some big moral battlefield, you can thank the gods. Because the Egyptian gods, oh, they set the tone in dramatic divine fashion. Let's start with Adam. According to the Heliopolitan creation myth, Atum didn't wait around for a partner. Nope. He created the world through a very enthusiastic solo act of self-love. From that act came Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. So the Egyptian universe literally began with one god, doing his thing. And bodily fluids. Now here's the thing. This wasn't considered scandalous. It wasn't something to blush about. It was revered. Adam's act wasn't just a physical gesture. It was a demonstration of divine power, a symbol that life begins with desire. And if the gods weren't ashamed, why should humans be? Next up, Osiris and Isis. Talk about Egypt's ultimate power couple. Their story isn't just myth, it's practically a soap opera. Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set. Isis, undeterred and incredibly committed, went on a mission to recover his body, and she found almost all of him. Almost. One very important part, you can guess which was missing. So what did she do? She made one, a magical replacement. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. She revived Osiris just long enough to conceive their son, Horus. That's dedication. That's also mythological time management at its finest. Then there's Min, the god of fertility and male potency. Statues of Min didn't leave much to the imagination. He's often depicted standing tall, very tall, proudly holding his most iconic attribute in one hand with a head of lettuce in the other. Yes, lettuce. Turns out lettuce symbolized fertility and sexual energy for Egyptians, more on that later. And let's not forget Hathor, the goddess of music, love, beauty, and drunken joy. She was often shown nude or semi-nude, surrounded by symbols of dancing seduction and celebration. Festivals in her honor. Think ancient Tinder with tambourines. Even Ra, the sun god, had his own unique contributions to creation. Sometimes through speech, other times through spitting. Not even kidding. Egyptian mythology definitely had its weird side. The point is, the gods modeled sexuality as divine natural and deeply intertwined with the rhythms of life. They didn't divide the sacred from the sensual, they blended them. Sex wasn't seen as a distraction from holiness. It was part of holiness. Now, not every Egyptian was offering sacred lettuce to fertility gods or building statues of themselves standing proud. Most were just ordinary folks. Farmers, potters, linen weavers, trying to find a little intimacy between feeding the animals and dodging crocodiles. Their love lives were far more down to earth than the gods. But even among regular people, intimacy wasn't something shameful or forbidden. Couples lived together, slept together, and raised kids together. And yes, they even left each other little love notes on broken pottery shards. Literal love notes scratched into bits of pots. Ancient texting at its finest. One message read, "I dream of your beauty by night." Kind of sweet, right? All right, we've only just opened the door to this fascinating, very real, and very human part of Egyptian life. But before we dive deeper into love poems, rituals, lettuce-based offerings, and the art that might make you blush, let's take a breath, because ancient Egypt didn't just have a different take on sexuality. It had a whole different vibe. A healthier, more balanced, and frankly, more grown-up view of what it meant to be human body, heart, and soul. All right, welcome back. So, we've talked about how the gods set the tone for Egypt's frank and sacred approach to sexuality. But what about the actual people? What about the farmers, the brewers, the weavers, and the herders? Well, the truth is, love in ancient Egypt was surprisingly normal, practical, down to earth. But that doesn't mean it wasn't romantic. Let's set the scene. Imagine you're a potter in a small village by the Nile. You wake up early, stretch your back, and check if your goat didn't wander off again. You're not crafting magical fertility statues or composing hymns to Hathor every morning. You're trying to figure out whether the neighbor 2 doors down, who makes really good beer and has a decent smile, is actually into you. That's the kind of love story most Egyptians lived. Romantic partnerships weren't arranged in secret or forced through elaborate rituals. In fact, one of the coolest things about ancient Egyptian society is how refreshingly informal the concept of marriage was. Forget about veils, flower arrangements, or banquet halls. If two people agreed to live together, shared food linens, and maybe a goat or two, boom, they were married. That's it. No priest, no ceremonial vows, no 17-tier cake. Marriage was a mutual understanding, not a public performance. Just two people, one house, and hopefully a working oven. And yes, there were written marriage contracts, especially in later periods, kind of like ancient prenups. These documents would detail what each person brought into the relationship and what would happen if things didn't work out. Some even included penalties for bad behavior. One contract basically said, "If you hit me, you owe me silver." Not exactly romantic, but definitely efficient. But what about affection? Was there love in these partnerships? Or was it all just grain sharing and property arrangements? Actually, yes, there was love. A lot of it. Tomb paintings, which, by the way, weren't just reserved for royalty, often show husbands and wives standing face to face, holding hands, touching each other gently. And these weren't just ceremonial poses. You can feel the warmth in their gestures. It wasn't uncommon to see couples embracing or sitting close together even thousands of years after their deaths. That says a lot about what mattered to them. Love poetry was also a big thing. And no, not stiff metaphors or vague references. We're talking real, raw, passionate lines like, "I will lie down at home and pretend to be sick so that you will come to see me. And if you come near me, I will get better." That's not mythic symbolism, that's ancient flirting with a plan. These poems scratched onto papyrus or pottery shards weren't just written by men. Women wrote love poetry too, and in the first person. That's pretty rare in the ancient world. Egyptian women expressed desire, joy, longing, without shame or apology. They described sneaking glances across the lotus pond, watching their crush from a distance, or wishing he'd stop talking to her sister and just ask her to dinner already. Okay, not dinner, more like shared dates and fresh beer. But you get the point. It's this honesty, this openness that makes their approach feel so modern. Because in Egypt, desire wasn't something to repress. It was something to celebrate. They didn't blush about it. They sang about it. And they were practical about it too. Fertility wasn't just spiritual or poetic. It was physical, seasonal, and critical to survival. Just like the Nile flooded on schedule, the Egyptians tracked their own cycles. Women knew their rhythms. Men had herbal tonics. And yes, there was always at least one grandmother with weird but earnest advice involving honey and onions. Even birth control existed. Not always effective. We'll talk about crocodile dung later, but they tried. They had pregnancy tests involving barley and emmer seeds. They had midwives' fertility charms and tonics. There was no big mystery about where babies came from, and when they didn't come, when couples struggled with infertility, there were medical remedies and magical prayers. You'd light a candle for Isis, maybe rub a fertility statue, drink some strange herbal wine. It was all part of the process. But here's something that really stands out. The ancient Egyptians believed deeply in mutual affection. Relationships weren't about ownership or subjugation. While the society was patriarchal, like most ancient ones, Egyptian women had rights. They could own property, file for divorce, take ex-husbands to court. They weren't just baby makers or passive partners. They had agency. And speaking of divorce, it happened. And it wasn't a catastrophe. If a couple decided to split, it didn't become a public scandal. There were no messy trials or screaming uncles, just a property division and a return to separate bread ovens. That was it. Respectful separation. Move on with your life. So let's talk a bit about what it looked like to start a family. Was there a wedding? Not exactly. There might be a small feast. Some neighbors might drop by with gifts or advice. But there was no grand ceremony, no elaborate rituals. Just two people deciding they could tolerate each other's snoring for the next few decades. Clothing, pretty much the same as any other day. Linen garments, white breathable, sometimes pleated. No gowns, no tuxes, no hand-me-down tiaras, and no rings either. Egyptians didn't need gold bands to declare their love. Living together and sharing a life was declaration enough. But let's not pretend it was all sweetness and honey-scented lotus baths. Ancient relationships had their messes too. Adultery, for example, was frowned upon, especially for women. If a married woman was caught cheating, the social consequences could be harsh. Divorce shame, sometimes even punishment. And while men had a little more leeway, sleeping with another man's wife could land you in serious trouble, especially if that man had a high rank or a short temper. Still, there weren't a ton of laws regulating personal relationships. No mass purges, no moral inquisition. Society relied more on reputation gossip and the occasional side-eye at the market. Your love life was your business as long as it didn't interfere with someone else's marriage contract or inheritance. That brings us back to the heart of it all connection. For ancient Egyptians, sex and love weren't some tangled, dangerous mystery. They were just part of being human. Functional, sacred, and ideally satisfying. Next up, we're going to take a look at the gods again, not just the ones we mentioned before, but how their stories shaped Egyptian ideas about passion, pleasure, and divine reproduction. We'll even touch on that mysterious lettuce obsession and why ancient Egyptians thought it could help your love life. Trust me, it's going to get interesting. Welcome back. Now, we've talked about how the average ancient Egyptian approached love, intimacy, and partnership, and honestly, their grounded, affectionate approach was already impressive. But to really understand why sex was seen as sacred and powerful in Egypt, we need to climb higher. Higher than pharaohs, higher than pyramids, straight into the myths and legends of the gods themselves. Because here's the thing, the gods didn't just preach about fertility, they lived it loudly. We already met Atum, the OG solo creator, who kicked off existence with a little personal initiative and a cosmic one-man show. From his self-generating act came air and moisture, which, if you think about it, kind of sets the tone for a very sensual universe. But he wasn't alone. Let's revisit Osiris and Isis for a second, because their story isn't just iconic, it's deeply romantic, dramatic, and loaded with layers. Osiris, as you may recall, got hacked into pieces by his jealous brother Set, and not in a metaphorical sense. Isis, who could have easily moved on or called it quits, decided instead to go full resurrection mode. She tracked down his dismembered body parts one by one across the Nile Valley. And when she couldn't find one very essential piece, she didn't panic. She built a magical replacement, a golden phallus powered by divine magic and determination. And yes, she brought him back long enough to conceive their son, Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship and sky. That's not just mythology, that's commitment. That's devotion with a DIY twist. It's also a symbolic affirmation that love, resurrection, and reproduction were inextricably linked in Egyptian belief. Life and sex weren't just physical things. They were cosmic forces. Then there's Min. If Osiris and Isis were about loyalty and divine conception, Min was about pure, unfiltered male potency. He wasn't subtle either. Statues of Min, leave very little to the imagination. He's usually shown standing upright, in all senses of the word, holding his own. Divine attribute in one hand, and often a head of lettuce in the other. Yes, lettuce. And no, it wasn't just a salad prop. In ancient Egypt, lettuce was more than a crunchy snack. The specific variety they used, tall, straight, and filled with a milky sap, symbolized virility. Egyptians noticed that well. It kind of looked like something, and they figured if a plant could ooze with that much enthusiasm, maybe it had magical fertility powers. So lettuce became men's official offering. You'd bring bundles of it to his shrine if you were hoping for a child, a partner, or a boost in romantic performance. Let's just say ancient Egyptian fertility rituals were not subtle, but they weren't shameful either. They were joyful, playful, even celebratory. A farmer might offer lettuce to men in hopes of having a healthy baby. A young woman might leave honey cakes for Hathor, hoping to attract the attention of a certain basket weaver. These rituals weren't hidden, they were part of community life. Speaking of Hathor, she's one of the most fascinating and multi-layered deities in the Egyptian pantheon, the goddess of love music, dance fertility, and drunken joy. Often depicted as a beautiful woman with cow ears or a sun disk between her horns, Hathor was basically the ancient Egyptian embodiment of good vibes. But she wasn't just a party girl. She was a deeply respected figure. Her temples were sites of healing celebration and connection. Festivals in her honor included music dancing, and according to some records, public expressions of affection and flirtation. People would drink wine, dance in groups, sing love songs, and pray for romance fertility, or just a bit of joy in the coming season. Kind of like ancient speed dating, but with tambourines and lotus garlands. Even the great sun god Ra, usually depicted as the stoic, all-seeing falcon-headed deity, had his moments of reproductive creativity. Some myths say he created the world not through battle or blood, but by speaking things into existence. Others say he spit literally, and in the Egyptian worldview, bodily fluids were creative forces, not gross accidents. Whether it was sweat, saliva, or semen, these elements were seen as life-giving, divine, and vital to creation. So when we say that the Egyptians merged the sacred and the sensual, we really mean it. Their gods weren't celibate or distant. They were active participants in the cycle of life. They desired, they touched, they flirted, they conceived, and in doing so, they gave divine permission for humans to do the same. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because while these myths may sound like stories, the Egyptians didn't treat them that way. They believed them, and more importantly, they modeled their behavior after them. If the gods didn't separate holiness from physicality, why should mortals? This attitude filtered into all areas of life. Medical texts from ancient Egypt include sexual health remedies, fertility treatments, and even contraception recipes. Some effective, some questionable. Again, crocodile dung. We're looking at you. Erotic art wasn't forbidden. It was included in daily objects like amulets, figurines, and even comedic papyri. One of the wildest examples, the Turin Erotic Papyrus, a rare and very graphic piece of ancient Egyptian art that some scholars believe was either satire adult entertainment or a kind of bachelor party gag gift. It features men and women engaging in all kinds of intimate acts, and it's extremely detailed, like shockingly detailed. So, no, the Egyptians weren't shy about sex, but they also didn't let it define their worth, their status, or their morality, or their awe. For them, desire was just part of being alive. It didn't need to be punished. It needed to be understood. And while yes, there were social expectations, especially around marriage and fidelity, The culture never tried to legislate love into oblivion. They understood that people had feelings. They made mistakes. They fell in love, and sometimes out of it. But through it all, they believed in the power of balance, Mayat, to restore harmony. Even the gods had drama. Set murdered his brother. Isis rebuilt him. Hathor danced her way into everyone's hearts. And men stood tall, lettuce in hand, ready to bless whoever needed a little help in the romance department. Up next, we're going to shift from the heavens back to earth and look at how Egyptian architecture, art, and even furniture reflected their attitudes about intimacy and pleasure, including why their beds were tilted and why tombs sometimes included instructions for afterlife intimacy. Yeah, you heard that right. Welcome back. So far, we've covered the sacred roots of intimacy in ancient Egypt, from divine lettuce and magical resurrection to flirtatious goddesses and cosmic solo acts. But what about the world humans actually lived in? What did love look like on the ground, in homes on walls, and even in the way people designed their most sacred spaces? Well, let's start at home. Literally, Egyptian houses, especially those of the middle and upper classes, were often built with intentional privacy in mind. Now, we're not talking about walk-in closets or couples' jacuzzis, but there were designated intimate areas, rooms set back from the public parts of the house, away from granaries, workshops, or guest quarters. It wasn't by accident. Ancient architects understood something that would make Freud proud. Intimacy thrives in quiet corners. Even in modest homes, there was usually a space carved out where couples could retreat. It wasn't about shame. It was about comfort. Egyptians didn't believe love was something to be hidden. But they did believe it deserved its own place. A setting where connection, affection, and physical closeness could happen away from work noise and nosy neighbors. And speaking of neighbors, let's just say ancient Egyptian walls weren't exactly soundproof. So while privacy was appreciated, it wasn't always guaranteed. Still, social etiquette kept people from making too big a deal out of it. As long as you weren't violating someone's marriage contract or property rights, your love life was frankly your business. Now let's talk about beds. Because even Egyptian furniture had things to say about their culture's approach to intimacy. Beds in ancient Egypt were often built with a slight tilt, raised at the head, sloping gently downward toward the feet. Some historians believe this was for airflow or cleanliness. Others think it was symbolic a gentle incline that mirrored the natural slope of the Nile or aligned with spiritual beliefs about direction and flow. But there's more. Bed frames were often carved with fertility symbols, protective deities, or animals associated with sensual energy, like cats or ibises. The headboard sometimes had magical texts invoking gods like Hathor or Bes to bless the space with love, laughter, and ideally healthy children. Bes, by the way, deserves a quick spotlight. He wasn't tall or graceful. In fact, he was short, round, and slightly terrifying at first glance. But this lion dwarf deity was considered a protector of households, especially pregnant women and newborns. He was also the unofficial patron of fun music, and you guessed it, sex. Figurines of Bes were often placed near beds to ward off evil spirits and bring joy. He was goofy, but powerful. A reminder that love, even divine love, didn't have to be serious all the time. Now, when it comes to art, the Egyptians were famously precise. Their wall paintings, statues, and carvings are known for their strict symmetry, formal poses, and side profile perfection. But even within that stylized world, love had a place. Tomb paintings often depicted couples not as abstract symbols, but as real people. A husband and wife standing side by side, their hands touching. Their faces turn toward each other instead of away. Sometimes the man has his arm gently around the woman's waist, or she's offering him a lotus flower, a symbol of rebirth and beauty. These weren't just artistic choices. They were spiritual declarations. Egyptians believed the afterlife was a continuation of the best parts of life on earth, including love and physical affection. So they wanted their tombs to reflect the relationships they hoped to carry into eternity. Inscriptions on tomb walls sometimes included wishes or prayers for ongoing intimacy. May we embrace forever. May your hand never leave mine. Imagine wanting to be close to someone for all of eternity and then carving that wish in stone. That's ancient love. Some tombs went even further. Archaeologists have found images and texts suggesting that the deceased wanted their physical forms, including, yes, their sexual organs, restored in the afterlife. In fact, Egyptian funerary texts specifically mention bodily resurrection, not just of limbs, but of reproductive capacity. Because in the Egyptian worldview, what's the point of eternal life if you can't enjoy it? The Book of the Dead. The ancient guide to navigating the afterlife includes spells to ensure your body is whole again, that your legs walk, your arms move, your heart is judged fairly, and your more intimate anatomy is, let's say, reinvigorated. Osiris himself was famously reassembled, including his symbolic golden phallus, before conceiving Horus with Isis. So yes, even the gods planned for intimacy beyond the grave. It wasn't just about physical pleasure, though. That was part of it. It was about connection, about balance, about harmony. Egyptians didn't believe that love stopped with death. In fact, they believed it was one of the few things worth carrying with you into the field of reeds, their version of paradise. Picture this endless, fertile fields, warm breezes, calm waters, and your soulmate beside you forever. That's what they imagined. And they built their tombs, wrote their texts, and designed their art to make sure that dream could come true. It's worth noting that even eroticism, when it appeared, was usually framed in a celebratory, not scandalous light. Take the infamous Turin erotic papyrus, a rare and incredibly explicit scroll now tucked away in an Italian museum. It's full of cartoonishly exaggerated scenes of intimacy, possibly intended as satire or comedic entertainment. Some scholars think it was a parody of fertility cults. Others think it might have been ancient adult humor. But either way, it reminds us the Egyptians had a sense of humor about love too. They weren't prudish. They were playful. They knew that sex wasn't always sacred chanting and rose petals. Sometimes it was clumsy funny and very, very human. Now, we've explored a lot of earthly love and even afterlife romance. But what about the gray areas, the boundaries? What happened when love went wrong? What were the rules? And what happened when you broke them? In Part 5, we're diving into the complicated world of fidelity, jealousy, and ancient relationship drama. Adultery, divorce double standards, and even curses. Yeah, it's about to get spicy. All right, let's talk about the messier side of love in ancient Egypt. Because as much as they valued harmony, balance, and sacred affection, the Egyptians weren't immune to temptation, heartbreak, or the occasional scandalous slip-up. Just like us, let's get one thing straight. Fidelity was respected. In theory, monogamy, especially within marriage, was the ideal. It symbolized stability, trust, and social harmony. But in practice, let's just say things were a little more flexible, depending on who you were and how much land your family owned. For everyday folks, cheating wasn't necessarily a legal catastrophe. There weren't massive witch hunts or public executions, but it could still cause serious problems socially and economically. If a married woman was caught in adultery, especially with a man who wasn't her husband, the fallout could be dramatic. She could be divorced, shunned, or in rare, elite cases, punished physically or banished altogether. Why so harsh? Simple ancient Egyptian society, while progressive in many ways, was still patriarchal. A woman's fidelity was often linked to paternity, making sure a man's children were actually his. It was less about morality and more about inheritance property and family continuity. If a man suspected his wife had strayed, he could present evidence and initiate a divorce. There wasn't a trial per se, just a process of separating shared property and deciding who kept what. The community might whisper. Friends might distance themselves. And if kids were involved, especially young ones, they usually stayed with the mother unless the father had a powerful case or powerful friends. Now, here's where it gets a little uneven. Men had more leeway. A married man having a fling with an unmarried woman. It wasn't applauded, but it was often overlooked. A married man with another married woman. That's where things got messy, because then you're messing with someone else's property. Household and honor, and ancient Egyptians, like humans everywhere, really didn't like sharing spouses. But even with all that, adultery wasn't typically a crime in the legal sense. There weren't pages of laws punishing it, no scarlet letters, no prisons for cheaters. The system relied more on gossip, community shame, and poetic justice. And yes, ancient Egyptians believed in poetic justice. Some texts from the New Kingdom describe adulterers meeting tragic fates. One story tells of a man who sleeps with another man's wife and ends up cursed, impotent, or tormented by spirits. Another warns that such men will be hunted by jackal-headed gods or lose their place in the afterlife. So if the law didn't scare you, maybe the threat of divine vengeance did. But not everyone got caught. And even if they did not, everyone cared. The wealthy and powerful often operated under different standards. Pharaohs, nobles, and high priests could have multiple partners, concubines, or even entire harems. These arrangements were usually formalized with rules, titles, and rankings. And here's the thing, many of these elite relationships weren't just about love. They were about alliances. Marriages could unite provinces. Partnerships could expand influence. And having multiple lovers could even be seen as a sign of virility, status, or divine favor, especially if you were seen as a descendant of gods. But that doesn't mean those relationships were without jealousy. Love triangles, power struggles, and whispered rumors were just as much a part of palace life as gold jewelry and elaborate wigs. Some letters and court documents even show signs of emotional drama. One man writes that he suspects his wife of harboring feelings for another, not because of any obvious act, but because of how she laughs around him. Another complains that his wife keeps visiting a neighbor to borrow herbs far too often. Sound familiar? Even in a culture as practical and grounded as Egypt's, love could still go sideways. People got insecure, suspicious, heartbroken. They fought, made up, broke up, and sometimes cursed each other under their breath. And those curses, oh, they were serious. The ancient Egyptians believed words had power. You didn't just insult someone, you could curse them. People wrote incantations to ruin their enemies' love lives, to drive a rival couple apart, or to ensure an unfaithful partner's heart would never rest. Some even buried figurines with names carved into them, bound in string, pierced with pins, to bind or punish the emotionally disloyal. So yeah, relationship drama wasn't new. It just had more sand and scarabs. But here's something else worth noting. For all the potential for chaos, there were safeguards. Marriage contracts, especially among the elite, often included clauses for what would happen if one partner cheated. Sometimes the cheating party had to pay a fine. Other times, they lost property or were forced to return dowry goods. It was messy, but it was manageable. And at the end of the day, divorce was always an option. Unlike many ancient societies, where divorce was either forbidden or brutally one-sided, Egyptians allowed both men and women to initiate a split. It wasn't easy. It wasn't painless. But it was allowed. A woman could take her ex-husband to court if he tried to cheat her out of property. She could keep her own belongings, return to her father's house, or even remarry if she chose. The system wasn't perfect. No system is, but it was shockingly equitable for its time. And what about the children? Well, they weren't just used as leverage. Egyptians believed strongly in protecting their offspring, even after a failed marriage. Fathers were often expected to contribute resources. Mothers were expected to provide care. And both parents were expected to maintain some kind of dignity because community respect mattered. Love could fall apart. Trust could be broken. But life had to go on. Crops still needed planting. Markets still opened. And the Nile. It never stopped flowing. So what can we take from all this? Maybe that love has always been complicated. That fidelity, while sacred, has always had gray areas. That passion doesn't always follow rules, even when you've written them in hieroglyphs and sealed them with a lotus petal. And maybe just maybe, be that the ancient Egyptians, in all their sacred ritual and practical logic, understood something we still struggle with today. That love isn't about perfection. It's about balance. And when balance tips, you find a way to restore it through kindness, clarity, or if all else fails, a stern warning carved into a stone tablet. Coming up in Part 6, sibling marriage, royal unions, and the eyebrow-raising reality of keeping it all in the family. Yeah, we're going there. All right, deep breath. Because this next part, it's where things start to feel a little complicated. So far, we've been walking through a world where love was sacred, sex was functional, and relationships were built on mutual affection and cosmic balance. But when you start climbing up the social ladder, especially into royalty, things get kind of awkward. Let's talk about sibling marriage. Yep, you heard that right. If your first reaction is, wait, they did what? Don't worry, that's pretty universal. Most modern readers respond with a raised eyebrow and a full-body cringe. But for the pharaohs and royal families of ancient Egypt, marrying your sibling wasn't scandalous. It was tradition, expected even. Now, before we unpack the how and why, let's make something clear. This wasn't common among everyday Egyptians. Farmers, merchants, potters, regular folks married outside their immediate families just like people do today. In rural areas, cousin marriage occasionally happened, but sibling marriage, that was strictly reserved for royalty. So, why? Why would anyone want to marry their brother or sister? Well, the answer has less to do with romance and a lot more to do with power politics and divine bloodlines. Let's rewind. In ancient Egyptian mythology, the gods, the ones they believed pharaohs descended from, married their siblings. Isis and Osiris were brother and sister. So were Shu and Tefnut. Even Nut and Geb, the sky and the earth, were divine siblings who produced the next generation of gods. To the Egyptians, that wasn't weird. It was cosmically ordered. Divine harmony required divine unity, and the gods married within their own ranks to preserve that balance. So if you're a pharaoh, literally seen as a living god on earth, Who do you marry to maintain that godlike status? The commoner. A noble from another house. Nope. You marry someone from your own divine bloodline, preferably your sister. It sounds bizarre to us, but in their minds, it made perfect sense. It kept the royal blood pure. It kept power consolidated within the family. And it eliminated the risk of outsiders gaining influence through marriage. Think about it. If a pharaoh married a noblewoman from another powerful family, that family might try to push their own agenda at court. But if he married his sister, someone raised with the same values, the same lineage, the same education, there were no competing loyalties. Just unity. Of course, unity doesn't always mean happiness. Sibling marriages, especially at the royal level, weren't necessarily romantic. They were strategic. These weren't love stories. They were contracts. Sometimes the pharaoh would have multiple wives, some sisters, some foreign princesses, but the sister wife was often the one with ceremonial importance. She'd be featured in public rituals, carvings, and temple dedications. She was the queen, the great royal wife. And yes, this tradition went on for centuries. One of the most famous cases, Tutankhamun King Tut. Modern DNA analysis confirmed that his parents were siblings, and the consequences, pretty rough. Tut was born with multiple congenital issues, including a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and a compromised immune system. His health problems were likely the result of generations of inbreeding, a harsh reminder that keeping things in the family genetically comes at a cost. But even with those risks, the tradition persisted. Let's fast forward to the Ptolemaic period that's after Alexander the Great's conquest, when Egypt was ruled by Greek-speaking pharaohs, the most famous Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. She technically married her brothers. Both of them. Ptolemy III and later Ptolemy XIII. Not because she was in love with them, quite the opposite actually, but because it was expected. The royal line needed to look united. But make no mistake, Cleopatra ruled largely on her own, and eventually she aligned herself with powerful outsiders, first Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony, both of whom, thank the gods, were not related to her. Still, those early royal marriages served their purpose. They told the public, we are unified, we are divine, we are untouchable. Of course, behind the palace doors, things were messier. Power struggles, assassinations, betrayals. Some royal siblings fought more than they loved. Some were raised together and then forced into ceremonial unions. Others barely spoke to each other outside of public appearances. These weren't fairy tales. They were dynastic chess matches. And while this tradition might make our modern stomachs turn, it's important to remember that it wasn't born out of romance. It was born out of religion and control. To them, marrying your sister wasn't about desire. It was about maintaining order, cosmic order, political order, mythological order. And if that meant a few awkward family dinners, so be it. But again, this was not the norm for most Egyptians. Ordinary people married people from other families, from neighboring villages, from market stalls, from fellow worshippers at the local temple. They looked for practical traits, strong backs, good teeth, steady hands, kindness, humor, maybe a decent beer recipe. They didn't worry about keeping a divine bloodline. They worried about surviving the flood season, which is why the whole sibling marriage tradition, as fascinating as it is, remained an elite oddity. A strange custom, wrapped in gold, buried with masks and fanfare, but never replicated in the mud brick homes along the Nile. So what does this all tell us? That even in a culture that deeply valued harmony, some traditions stretched that harmony to its limits. That the line between sacred and strange is often a matter of context. And that power, when dressed in religious robes, can justify almost anything. Next up in part 7, love poetry, ancient flirting, and the surprisingly steamy metaphors Egyptians used to talk about desire, from lotus flowers to honey cakes and everything in between. Trust me, you're going to want to hear these. Welcome back, and now we're turning the heat up a little. Because while the gods modeled divine desire and the royals tangled in power, marriages, the average ancient Egyptian had their own language for love. And it wasn't just functional or sacred, it was steamy, poetic, and honestly kind of adorable. So, let's step away from sibling marriages and royal drama and slip into something softer, like love poems. Sweet, playful, often passionate, and sometimes straight-up seductive Egyptian love poetry is one of the most human windows we have into their emotional world. These weren't dusty declarations carved in cold stone. They were personal, vibrant, and full of life. Think first-person confessions, longing gazes, and a surprising number of garden metaphors. The kind of poetry that says, I want you, I dream of you, and I wrote it down on a potsherd because papyrus is expensive. One of the best things these poems were written by both men and women. That's rare in the ancient world. Most ancient cultures only preserved male voices in literature, warriors, kings, priests. But Egypt gave women a voice too. They wrote from their own perspectives, speaking freely about love, attraction, and desire. Let's look at a few real examples. One woman writes, I shall lie down at home and pretend to be sick. Then you will come and see me. And if you come near me, I will get better. Now that's a whole plot right there. This is the ancient version of texting I'm dying, unless you come over. Another poem written by a man reads, My love is one and only, without peer more beautiful than the full moon. Smooth, right, but it gets even better. Some of these poems get suggestive, not vulgar, but definitely flirtatious. They use fruit lotus flowers gardens and even beer as metaphors for the body and pleasure. One of the most famous lines, her voice is sweeter than beer. Now that's how you win someone over in an ancient tavern. Here's another, she has no rival. She is more beautiful than any woman alive. Her lips are as sweet as lotus petals, her breasts like twin pomegranates. That's not just appreciation. That's admiration, wrapped in metaphor and dipped in honey. Egyptian love poetry was playful, earthy, and unafraid. They didn't need flowery fluff or stiff formality. They said what they meant, and they meant it with passion. You see, in ancient Egypt, desire wasn't something shameful. It wasn't something to hide behind ceremony or coded language. It was natural. It was necessary. And it was fun. And they didn't just write it, they performed it. At banquets, festivals, and family gatherings, people would recite poems aloud. Some were serious. Some were silly. Some probably made grandmothers blush. But they were all part of the culture, part of expressing affection in a world where love was as important as water. Imagine sitting under a fig tree with oil lamps glowing and music playing. Someone picks up a lyre, strums a few notes, and recites a verse about how their lover walks more gracefully than a gazelle or smells better than a newly baked honey cake. That was date night ancient Egyptian style. And while some of the metaphors feel timeless, like comparing a lover's eyes to stars, others are very much rooted in their world. Take gardens, for example. They weren't just green spaces, they were symbols of fertility, pleasure, and peace. A well-kept garden was a source of pride and prosperity. So naturally, it became a metaphor for a lover's body. Lines like, I shall enter her garden and gather lotus flowers, sound innocent, until you read it a second time. Another favorite, hunting. Not in a violent way, more like pursuit. Love poems often described lovers as hunters chasing wild game or compared desire to a falcon. diving after a rabbit. Seduction. Egyptian style was often playful, a chase across riverbanks, a glance over a shoulder, a tug of a sash. And let's not forget food, especially honey. Sweet golden rare honey was a luxury, a gift, and a metaphor for kisses, touch, and sometimes more. If someone said you were like honey on the lips, that was a compliment with layers. Now, some people think love poetry is just a young person's game. But in ancient Egypt, it wasn't limited to youth. Even older couples married for years, raising children, running farms, used poetry to keep the spark alive. We have love letters from husbands to wives, saying things like, "Without you, the house is empty," or "Your laughter is the sun to my morning." These weren't just romantic gestures. They were real feelings written down in ink and kept for posterity. One beautiful tradition was carving love messages into personal objects like mirrors, combs, or amulets. Some women carried charms inscribed with lines from poems. Some men kept pots etched with phrases like, "I remember your eyes," or "You make my heart beat like drums." Even in tombs, couples would include romantic stanzas alongside prayers. Because for them, love didn't end at death. It continued in the afterlife, in the field of reeds, where they hoped to walk hand in hand forever. It's honestly kind of amazing. In a culture where death was constantly near from war, disease, childbirth, the Egyptians didn't retreat into cold logic. They embraced life, fully, emotionally, passionately. They flirted, they touched, they wrote poems about longing and desire and laughter and lips, and in doing so, they left behind something incredibly human. So if you've ever written a love note, sent a romantic text, or scratched someone's initials into a tree, congratulations, you've got something in common with a civilization from over 3,000 years ago. In Part 8, we're taking this even deeper into the world of ancient contraception fertility rituals, and yes, the infamous crocodile dung contraceptive recipe. Because when it came to planning families, the Egyptians were creative, sometimes wildly so. All right, we've talked about flirtation, poetry, and passion. Now let's get into something a little more practical, and let's be honest, a little weird. Because while the Egyptians were great romantics, they were also incredibly pragmatic, especially when it came to fertility. See, in ancient Egypt, having children wasn't just a nice idea. It was a duty, a spiritual one, a societal one, a personal one. Kids meant continuity. They meant security in old age, more hands to harvest grain, and someone to pour water on your tomb, offering long after you were gone. So, if you couldn't conceive, that wasn't brushed aside. It was investigated, treated, and sometimes prayed over, hard. But first, what if you didn't want to conceive? What if you weren't ready? Or it just wasn't the right season for a baby? Well, the Egyptians had a solution. Several, in fact. Some of them sound surprisingly advanced. Others, not so much. Let's start with the big one. Crocodile dung. Yes, this was real. One of the oldest medical texts we have, the Ebers Papyrus dating to around 1550 BCE, describes a recipe for contraception involving crocodile dung, sourdough, and honey. The idea was to form it into a paste and insert it vaginally, essentially as a barrier method. Now, if you're recoiling in horror right now, you're not alone. Modern science would obviously not recommend this, but here's what's interesting. The concept wasn't completely off base. They were trying to create a physical and acidic barrier to block sperm. Gross, yes. But it shows an understanding that something physical could prevent pregnancy. And this wasn't the only recipe. Another involved acacia gum, honey, and dates. This one is a little more impressive when acacia ferments. It produces lactic acid, which does have spermicidal properties. So, In a weird twist of history, some ancient contraceptives may have actually worked kind of like an early version of the modern diaphragm or pessary. Herbs were also part of the toolkit. Honey, onions, figs, and herbal wines were used both to encourage or prevent conception. Some were brewed into teas, others were made into topical salves. The exact effectiveness, hard to say, but the intent was there. They were trying. And let's talk about midwives, because these women were the real heroes of ancient Egyptian reproductive health. They weren't doctors in the modern sense, but they held generations of knowledge passed from mother to daughter, healer to apprentice. They knew when to cut, when to wait, and when to call on the gods. Midwives managed pregnancy labor and postpartum care. They advised on herbs. They tracked menstrual cycles. They conducted early pregnancy tests, and this is fascinating by having a woman urinate on barley and emmer seeds. If the seeds sprouted, she was likely pregnant. If not, maybe next month. And guess what? Modern researchers tested this method and found it was about 70% accurate. Not bad for 3,000 years ago. But contraception and pregnancy were only half the story. Sometimes, couples wanted to increase fertility. And that's where the magical side of medicine came in. People appealed to fertility deities, especially Isis, Hathor, Min, and Bes. They'd leave offerings at shrines, carve prayers onto amulets. Some even buried fertility figurines under their beds. One popular charm showed a woman holding her breasts, a symbol of nourishment and motherhood. And of course, there was the lettuce thing. We touched on it before, but let's dig deeper. Egyptians used romaine lettuce, which grows tall and oozes a white sap when cut. To them, this wasn't salad, it was symbolic potency. It looked and behaved like male arousal. So naturally, it became associated with Min, the god of fertility and male virility. Lettuce offerings were common at fertility temples. People believed eating or offering lettuce could enhance sexual health. Whether it actually did anything, that's up for debate, but the symbolism, unmistakable. And just like today, people had superstitions around pregnancy and birth. Women wore amulets shaped like hippos in honor of Tauret, the protective goddess of childbirth, or carried figurines of Bes, the dwarf god who warded off evil spirits. And if medicine didn't work, there was always magic. Some spells were written on papyri and recited over drinks. Others were scratched onto pottery and broken, the idea being that shattering the pot would release the charm. Some women even made offerings of bread shaped like body parts, hoping to heal or enhance that area. Let's not forget, ancient Egyptian medicine wasn't separate from religion. Everything blurred together. Herbs and prayers, potions and chants. If your pregnancy failed, it might be a medical issue or a divine punishment. If you conceived, it was because the gods smiled on you. And infertility, it wasn't just a woman's issue. Egyptian medical texts include both male and female evaluations, though let's be honest, women got most of the attention and the blame. Still, society didn't shun couples who couldn't conceive. There was sadness, there was pressure, but there was also support, rituals, remedies, hope, because in Egypt, fertility was more than a personal matter. It was cosmic. It was agricultural. It was economic. The same rhythm that governed the Nile governed the womb. Water rises, crops grow, life blooms or doesn't. And when it didn't, you didn't give up. You lit another candle, drank another tonic, whispered another prayer, and maybe added a little more honey. In Part 9, we'll explore how sexuality and intimacy were viewed in the afterlife, because Egyptians didn't believe passion ended at death. In fact, they made very detailed plans to make sure it didn't. So, after all the love poems, fertility rituals, and awkward sibling marriages. What happened after death was intimacy, over when the body was wrapped and the tomb was sealed, not in ancient Egypt. In fact, they planned very carefully for love affection and even sexual fulfillment to continue in the next life. Because the Egyptians didn't believe that death ended the story. They believed it was just a transition, one where the good parts of life could go on forever if you did things right. Let's start with the Field of Reeds, or Aru as they called it. It was their version of paradise. Imagine a perfectly fertile landscape filled with golden wheat fields, clear canals, and gentle breezes. Everyone had a house. Everyone had food. Everyone looked their best age, probably around 30. And most importantly, you weren't alone. Tomb inscriptions often mention the hope of being reunited with one's beloved in the afterlife. These weren't just abstract hopes. They were formal wishes carved into stone and placed beside the body. Couples wanted to walk together, work together, even sleep together after death. And this wasn't just emotional companionship. Many tomb texts specifically reference intimacy, physical closeness, affectionate touch, even sexual pleasure. Yes, Egyptians were planning for that kind of eternal reunion. Take a moment to think about that. While some ancient religions viewed the afterlife as cold or sterile, the Egyptians believed it could be warm, passionate, even sensual. Some tomb art shows husbands and wives embracing, reclining together on beds, exchanging gestures of affection. Others show shared banquets. Food and drink were big symbols of pleasure, or scenes of music and dance meant to stir the senses. And get this, in the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. There are sections specifically devoted to reanimating the body. We're not just talking about legs and arms, but all parts, including sexual organs. That's right. Ancient Egyptians had spells to make sure your reproductive parts worked in the afterlife. Why? Because fertility was life. Creation was sacred. And if the gods enjoyed it, if Isis and Osiris reunited through divine love to birth Horus, then why shouldn't humans do the same? It wasn't seen as dirty. It wasn't taboo. It was natural, beautiful, and eternal. Let's zoom in on some examples. A famous tomb inscription reads, "May we lie together in the field of reeds, joined in body and in heart, renewed forever." Another says, "I await you with longing in the west, where the sun dies and the lovers rise." Some inscriptions describe lovers embracing like the lotus unfolds at sunrise, a poetic metaphor that, if you've been paying attention, you know carries sensual weight. But it wasn't just about couples who died together. Sometimes one partner passed years before the other, and when the second person died, the family would arrange for the two to be buried side by side or in matching tombs to reunite them for eternity. There are even instances where people buried gifts for their lovers to receive in the afterlife: combs, perfume jars, love letters, bits of jewelry, personal touches that said, "I'll find you again." One preserved love letter, found buried with a young man, was addressed to his deceased wife. It read, "You left me too soon, but I will follow. Wait for me in the garden. When I arrive, I will bring the wine." Chills, right? And just like in life, the gods played a role in afterlife love. Hathor was still worshipped as a goddess of beauty and joy. Bes still protected homes even after death. Taweret still stood guard over fertility. The dead were believed to pass through judgment, and if their hearts were light, if they had lived with Ma'at, or truth and harmony, they could enter paradise whole. And that word whole meant everything. Of course, there were rules. Just like in life, The afterlife wasn't guaranteed. If your heart was heavy with lies or cruelty, if you had mistreated others, including your partner, you might not make it to the field of reeds at all. Your soul could be devoured by Amit the fearsome part crocodile, part lion beast who ended your existence permanently. So yeah, there was motivation to be a good spouse. And here's one more twist. Mummification wasn't just about preservation. It was about preparation. When priests embalmed the dead, they were restoring the body to its full divine form. Every toe, every finger, every symbol of life, including sexuality, was honored. Even coffins and sarcophagi often included painted scenes of affection. In some elite burials, you'd find carvings of couples holding hands, kissing, or lying together beneath star-strewn ceilings. Because in death, they didn't just want peace. They wanted passion, and they planned for it. Think about how intimate that is. You're buried next to the person you love. You've left letters, art poems, and prayers, and you believe with every fiber of your being that someday you'll rise together. Renewed, reunited. That's not just spirituality. That's love in its boldest form. Coming up next in part 10, our final chapter, we'll bring it all together. We'll take one last look at the Egyptian view of sex, love, and the body. The contradictions, the revelations, and why their world might just have something powerful to teach ours. So here we are, after a long, winding journey through papyrus, scrolls, temple walls, love poems, and even crocodile dung. It's time to tie it all together. Because what the ancient Egyptians believed about love, sex, and relationships wasn't just about ritual or reproduction. It was about connection between people, between families, between mortals and the divine. They saw sex not as something shameful or secretive, but as a vital part of life. It was practical, sacred, romantic, and even political all at once. It could create joy or heartbreak, children or curses, harmony or scandal. Sound familiar? But unlike many ancient societies, and even some modern ones, the Egyptians didn't try to erase or suppress sexuality. They wove it into their worldview, into their gods, into their art, into their afterlife. Let's recap a few things that make their approach unique and maybe even timeless. First, they believed love mattered, emotionally, spiritually, physically. Love wasn't just for poets or kings, it was for everyone. From farmhands writing sweet nothings on pottery shards to queens declaring eternal devotion in tomb inscriptions, love was everywhere. Second, they didn't separate the body from the soul. The physical wasn't dirty, it wasn't sinful, it was necessary. Whether you were making love in the shadow of a palm tree or preparing for it in the field of reeds, your body was an extension of your spirit. They believed in taking care of it, adorning it, honoring it, and yes, using it to express pleasure, connection, and creation. Third, they believed women had power in love. Women could flirt, choose divorce, remarry, and even write poems about their crushes. They were midwives, lovers, protectors, and spiritual guides. They had agency, not always equally, not always perfectly, but far more than many cultures would offer for thousands of years after. And finally, they saw death as a continuation, not a cancellation. They didn't believe your passions ended with your last breath. They planned for kisses in the afterlife, for shared meals, for whispered laughter beneath sacred trees. Their gods modeled passion. Their funerals included poetry. Their magic included love spells and fertility rites. Of course, they weren't perfect. Some customs, like sibling marriage, feel downright disturbing to us today. Power imbalances existed. Not all relationships were happy. Not all unions were equal. Like any human society, there was contradiction, tension between ideals and reality. But here's the key. The Egyptians didn't pretend love was simple. They knew it could uplift and undo you, that it could be sacred or scandalous, that sometimes it bloomed like lotus petals, and other times it crumbled like sand. And they still chose to celebrate it, every single part. Even today, their whispers echo across tomb walls and temple pillars. Their laughter, longing, and devotion linger in the texts and statues they left behind. So what can we take from this ancient wisdom? Maybe that we don't need to divide love into neat little boxes, that it's okay to be messy, bold, tender, and funny all at once, that our bodies are not burdens, but bridges to each other, to joy, to the divine. Maybe like the Egyptians, we should write more love poems, offer more flowers, let ourselves be loved, not just in theory, but in practice. Because whether we're under the hot Egyptian sun or the pale glow of modern city lights, love is still the oldest spell we know. And maybe someone out there is still reading our words thousands of years later, wondering what kind of people we were and how deeply we cared.